During the weekend of June the 20th to 22nd, 2025, the Ffestiniog Railway celebrated the Platinum Jubilee of its commencement of operations during the preservation era. Here, on the evening of June the 21st, 2025, we can see some rolling stock movements at Porthmadog. The rolling stock consists of Spooner bogie carriage number 16 of 1872, ex-Welsh Highland Ashbury bogie carriage number 23 of 1894, and bogie brake van number 10. The locomotive is the overhaul reconstruction of the original Vulcan foundry locomotive Taliesin. Nearby can be seen another recent new build, the 1992 vintage double fairley David Lloyd George. Later in the evening, the two 1893 ex-Penryn Hunslet ladies await to depart to Blaenau Ffestiniog with the Mountain Prince. While Palmerston passes by on the Welsh Highland Railway road. The Mountain Prince sets off for Blaenau Ffestiniog. On the morning of June the 22nd, the participants in the cavalcade shortly to follow are being prepared at Boston Lodge workshops. Here we see Princess of 1863, the second delivered of the four original locomotives built by George England of Hatcham Iron Works, London. This locomotive was the first in steam on the railway. Much altered over the years, including from side to saddle tank and provided with a tender, Princess hauled the last train under the old regime on August 1st, 1946. Princess is seen here from the right-hand side. The locomotive has never been restored to working order during the preservation era, but it has served as a roving ambassador for the railway in recent years, visiting such places as London's King's Cross and Paddington stations and Dublin's Euston station. Welsh Pony was one of the pair of enlarged 040 saddle tank and tender locomotives built in 1867 by George England as maker's number 234. As with Princess, it has been much rebuilt over the years, carrying four boilers during the pre-preservation era. Initially withdrawn in 1940, thoughts of restoration to working order were eventually raised in 2010, with dismantling for assessment taking place 4 years later. The rebuild was initially completed in time for a return to steam on June the 27th, 2020, with re-entry into traffic on the following July the 18th. It had been necessary initially to replace the boiler, mainframes and cylinders, and build a new tender based on the original England 1867 design. In 2024-5, the existing wheel centres were replaced with new castings, retaining the old tyres, axles and inside motion. Welsh Pony is seen here, having its firebox and tanks replenished. Double Fairley David Lloyd George is another example of the preservation era new wave of construction, having been completed at Boston Lodge in 1992, originally using pre-existing bogies and oil firing. It also incorporated a new design of taper boiler. Over the years, new bogies incorporating monoblock cylinders and piston valves have been fitted, and the locomotive has been converted to coal firing. The locomotive has always followed the first pair of Boston Lodge built double Fairleys in its aesthetic properties, and the second of these, Livingston Thompson of 1885, is now on display in the National Railway Museum in York. Largely owing to the early closure of the Linton and Barnstaple Railway in 1935, the new build locomotive lid, inspired by that railway's Manning Model 262 tank Loo of 1925, is one of the Ffestiniog's more popular locomotives. Construction initially commenced in Cornwall, but the project was later moved to Boston Lodge, with much of the chassis assembly being outsourced to Esker Engineering in Wigan. The rolling chassis was first displayed at the 1999 Ffestiniog Railway Gala, and construction continued, including an oil-fired boiler from Israel Newton in 2002 until 2010. During this period, the embryonic locomotive appeared at the National Railway Museum Railfest in May and June 2004 in celebration of the 200th anniversary of the steam locomotive. It made its first public runs during the Welsh Highland Railway Superpower weekend in September 2010. Soon after completion, Lyd visited the Launceston Steam Railway and the current Linton and Barnstaple Railway project, and in 2011 it was converted to coal firing. In more recent times, the 762 Club of the Linton and Barnstaple Railway has begun schemes to recreate the line's 4 original Manning Model 262 tanks of 1898. 4 pairs of cylinders and other components for these are currently in Boston Lodge works. Continuing the theme of Leeds-based designs, Lilla, an 1891-built Hunslet 040 saddle tank, is seen undergoing preparation for Sunday's event at Boston Lodge. Built for the Kilgin Slate Quarry, an independent feeder to the North Wales Narrow Gauge Railway, later Welsh Highland Railway, Lilla was sold to the Penryn Quarry in 1928 and withdrawn from service in 1955. Russell is a handsome 262 tank locomotive built by Hunslet Engine Company in 1906 for the Porthmadog, Bethgelert and South Snowdon Railway. It worked on the North Wales Narrow Gauge Railway before the Welsh Highland system was completed in 1923. During the winter of 1924-5, the locomotive's cab, dome and chimney were cut down in a vain attempt to facilitate running over the Ffestiniog Railway system. The locomotive was requisitioned for war service in 1942 at Hook Norton Ironstone Company in Oxfordshire, and in 1948 it was sold by the Ministry of Supply to the Fales Clay Tramway in Dorset, where it worked until 1953. In 1954, the Birmingham Locomotive Club bought Russell and put it on display in the Narrow Gauge Railway Museum at Towyn, where it remained until donation to the Welsh Highland Railway Limited, forerunners of the Welsh Highland Heritage Railway, in 1965. Repairs by Hunslet followed, along with storage at various locations and the provision of a new boiler in 1969. It finally arrived on the Welsh Highland Heritage Railway in 1987, complete with a new cab. Russell's design was related to 2-foot 6-inch gauge classes for Sierra Leone and India, the latter eventually enlarged to a 264 tank design, one example of which may survive, albeit in derelict condition. Palmerston is one of the 3 surviving rebuilt Small England 040 saddle tank and tender locomotives, and was delivered in 1864. As built, it was a cabless side tank, and in this form was engaged in construction of the North Wales Narrow Gauge Railway in 1876 to 1877. In 1880, it became the first of the 3 surviving members of the class to be fitted with cast iron mock saddle tanks for adhesion purposes, and 8 years later it was the first of the 3 remaining Small Englands to be rebuilt with a true saddle tank and cab, acquiring a new boiler in the process. Another new boiler was fitted during an extensive rebuild in 1910, and the locomotive was hired out to the Vale of Rydal Railway between 1912 and 1921. It was also used by the contractor McAlpine during the final stages of construction of the Welsh Highland Railway in 1923. It was rebuilt 10 years later with the shortened boiler from Little Giant, but by 1942 it had been relegated to use as a stationary boiler at Boston Lodge. Condemned as unrestorable by the 1960s, its hulk was sold with a wooden frame tender to a consortium of British rail engineers in 1974. Returned from Staffordshire in 1987 to the Ffestiniog Railway under the auspices of Mike Hart, the locomotive was returned to service in 1993. Having made several excursions to other venues during the intervening years, Palmerston was overhauled by the Vale of Rydal Railway in 2024. The Ffestiniog Railway's first single fairlie was built by Vulcan Foundry in 1876. It was successful, but it was out of use by 1924, being scrapped progressively until 1937. A new locomotive, inspired by its predecessor, was completed at Boston Lodge in 1999. It is slightly larger than its predecessor, owing to bogie design considerations, and it was built to be easily convertible from its original oil to coal firing, which was eventually undertaken in 2005. The new locomotive incorporates the reversing lever from the original, and it became the first Ffestiniog Railway fairlie locomotive to incorporate a monoblock piston valve cylinder casting of new design in 2011. Following the expiry of its boiler certificate in 2020, it has been overhauled and returned to service in 2025. The locomotive is seen here being polished in readiness for its appearance on the cob. The original double fairlie locomotive, James Spooner, was built by Avonside Engine Company in 1872. It was a pivotal design, bridging the gap between the experimental Little Wonder of 1869 and Murden Emery's, completed at Boston Lodge in 1879. Finally withdrawn in 1929, it was largely scrapped between 1935 and 1937. In 2016, it was announced that a new James Spooner was to be built, incorporating the bogies then carried by Earl of Merioneth. The new locomotive has a removable cab centre, and it has bells and whistles of similar configuration to the 1872 original. The boiler design combines the best features of the Hunslet boilers of 1971, for Merdin Emery's and Earl of Merioneth, and the newer tapered design for David Lloyd George as built. The aesthetic properties of the locomotive are largely inspired by those of Merdin Emery's as built in 1879. Originally scheduled for completion in 2020, the locomotive was delayed by 3 years owing to the COVID-19 pandemic. It is seen here undergoing polishing at Boston Lodge with the telltale can of Brasso on the running board. Prior to the cavalcade, the cab and the old side tanks of Mountaineer, the 262 tank locomotive, are seen on display in Boston Lodge Works. This locomotive was built by the American Locomotive Company of Paterson, New Jersey, as its maker's number 57,156 of 1916, one of 100 similar locomotives built for the British War Department Light Railways, where it was numbered 1,265. By 1935, it was with the Tramway de Profitier à Toury in France as its number 323, where it had received a raised cab and other modifications. Purchased by Ffestiniog Railway member John Ransom and brought to London in 1967, the loco was given to the Ffestiniog Railway Company later that year. It was soon fitted with a smaller cab suitable for the Ffestiniog Railway loading gauge, and subsequent modifications saw oil firing, a new boiler and piston valve steam chests. It also saw some operation over the Welsh Highland Railway system. The locomotive is currently under restoration to working order. Number 134 is an impressive 282 tender locomotive built by Société Anglo-Franco-Belge as maker's number 2684 of 1952. The locomotive was built for Namibia's Atavi Railway and transferred to South Africa's Aventura Port Elizabeth branch with his classmates in 1960 following regauging of the line in Namibia. It was withdrawn from service in South Africa in 1990 and brought to the United Kingdom with its sister, number 133, for an abortive scheme in Yorkshire. It was later acquired for use on the Welsh Highland Railway in 1998. After a protracted overhaul, including modifications to the boiler, drawgear, cab and tender, restoration was completed in September 2024. It entered public service in June 2025. Number 134 is seen here in steam at Boston Lodge prior to progressing onto the cob. An important feature of number 134 is that the mainframes have to incorporate a cutaway for the wide foundation ring to pass through. This lack of width-wise constraint of the firebox ensures that the locomotive cannot be termed a Leeds mainstream design in the way that Liller and Russell can. A unique visitor to the Platinum Anniversary celebrations was Challoner, an 1877 product of the Carnarvon concern De Winton & Company. This distinctive vertical boiler locomotive is normally based at the Leighton Buzzard narrow gauge railway in Bedfordshire, but it is seen here in preliminary movements on the cob. An important exhibit of the day was Vellingheli, Hunslet Works number 409 of 1886, the pre-prototype Alice class 040 saddle tank for the Dinorwic slate quarries. It has recently been restored to working order with a new boiler. Over the years, however, it has lost its original left-hand crosshead-driven feed pump. The brass dome cover, inherited from a previous dome boiler, has been retained, although it is now non-functional. Britomart, Hunslet Works number 707 of 1899, was built for the Penna Orseth quarry and was acquired by a consortium of Ffestiniog volunteers and workers in 1965. It is an updated version of the Alice class with a cab, redesigned mainframes and access holes in the leading buffer beam for the cylinder covers. It is seen here on the cob prior to the main event. Here are Linda, James Spooner, Welsh Pony, Palmerston and Hugh Napier moving onto the cob, followed by, in the next picture, the cab of Lilla, Velin Helly, Palmerston and David Lloyd George. The first locomotive onto the cob is appropriately the much rebuilt Small England locomotive Prince, which was the first steam locomotive used by the preservationists in 1955.
This is the oldest
Prince was followed by the first double fairlie of the day, the 1879 built Murden Emery's. This was the Ffestiniog Railway's third double fairlie and the first to be built at Boston Lodge. It has been restored to the early green livery of the preservation era. The next locomotive in the procession was Linda, which was built as one of two similar 040 saddle tank locomotives by Hunslet Engine Company in 1893 for the main line of the Penryn Quarry Railway, as a development of an earlier locomotive, Charles, of 1882. Linda was acquired by the Ffestiniog Railway in 1962, following closure of the Penryn main line, and has since been modified in several respects, including the addition of a leading truck and tender. Linda was followed by sister locomotive Blanche, also built as a 040 saddle tank, but now running, as with Linda, as a 240 saddle tank and tender. Blanche was acquired 2 years after Linda in 1964.
Ffestiniog is an area of great narrow gauge heritage. So this next grouping is headed by Porthmadog, the archetypal quarry locos. A group of volunteers in the 1960s, but brought here to live. And it's a wagon.
Following on from Blanche came the interesting combination of Quarry Hunslet 040 saddle tank locomotive Britomart, the cab and old tanks of 262 tank locomotive Mountaineer, and 040 vertical boiler tank locomotive Challoner. Next came two more of the Ffestiniog Railway's iconic double fairlies. The leading locomotive is Earl of Merioneth, completed in 1979, and out of use pending overhaul since 2018. Not in steam, it was propelled by David Lloyd George. Earl of Merioneth hauled the first passenger train into Blaenau Ffestiniog in 1982, following completion of the deviation line. The fairlies were followed by one of the Ffestiniog's great comeback stories. Abandoned as unrestorable by the 1960s and based in Staffordshire during part of the 1970s and 1980s, Palmerston has been a great asset to the line since restoration. Another iconic locomotive followed, in the shape of Velin-Heli. The basic Hunslet short wheelbase 040 saddle tank specification, incorporating Hunslet and Manning-Wardle influences of the 1870s, is still being built in modified form in the 21st century. Liller is another Leeds mainstream locomotive with larger cylinders, 9 inch by 14 inches, than the mainstream Quarry Hunslet. It also has a dome boiler. Keen observers will note the scar in the right-hand motion bracket left by the removal of the feed pump by the Penryn Quarry workshops. The locomotive has been resident on the railway since 1993. The reopening of the Welsh Highland Railway precipitated the demand for larger locomotives than had hitherto been used on the Ffestiniog line. Fortunately, a solution came in the form of the South African Railway's NGG 16 class 262 plus 262 Garratt locomotives that had formerly worked in Natal and on the country's Port Elizabeth to Aventura lines. Number 143, seen here, was one of the first 3 arrivals in Wales in 1997. Next come a beautifully matched pairing, the 1999 reconstruction of the single Fairlie locomotive Taliesin and the Welsh Highland Heritage Railway's Russell of 1906. The first pair of Garratts were built by Bayer Peacock in 1909 as numbers K1 and K2 for Tasmania's East Dundas Tramway. By the time of withdrawal in 1925, the survivor consisted of the power units of K1 and the boiler and cradle of K2.
Fantastic locomotives, but it's great to see it here this weekend. Now that sound is the sound of 87, I think. This is where the numbers really start.
Next came another NGG 16 class, this time number 87. Unlike number 143, which was built by Bayer Peacock in 1958, number 87 was built by Cockerill of Belgium in 1936. Initially imported for the failed Robin Hood's Bay scheme, number 87 found its way to the Welsh Highland Railway in 2006 via the Exmoor Steam Railway.
When we blow over, you know it really has gone. This is nervous.
Following on from number 87 came the Linton and Barnstable pattern new build 262 tank locomotive Lid. A classic second generation Leeds mainstream passenger specification, it makes an interesting comparison with Russell.
Just to finish the Captain Howie story, he didn't buy them because he thought they were too long for us. I'll let you make your decisions on that.
The next pair comprised the Penryn Large Quarry class Hugh Napier of 1904 and the non-operational Small England locomotive Princess.
The restored period, I remember it on the but it is lovely to see it.
These were followed by the sole surviving Large England locomotive Welsh Pony.
demonstrating this weekend. So we're getting close to the 200.
The third and last NGG 16 to take part in the cavalcade was number 130, a 1951 Bayer Peacock product. It was well complemented by its lined plum livery. And bringing up the 200 wheels on the cob, the new James Spooner.
We just hit 200 wheels. That's 200 wheels. 200 wheels on the cob. 200 wheels. Woo! We're almost through. The pain is almost over for you, William. We have with the FLI a bit more. It's a little bit more than you expected the FLI.
By way of a bonus, two further locomotives made their appearances in the cavalcade. The first of these was number 134, aka the Kalahari. It was hauling Tai Huchang number 4, a representative of the modern Chinese school of narrow gauge steam locomotive design, built by Harbin Locomotive Works of Manchuria in 1988 as makers number 221 to 2 foot 6 inch gauge. This 080 tender locomotive was imported by a syndicate of Ffestiniog Railway volunteers in 2007. The wooden tender body is a mock-up for restoration purposes. These last two locomotives added another 34 wheels between them, making up a grand total of 234 wheels across the cob.
Later in the afternoon, the cavalcade participants returned from the harbour station to Boston Lodge, across the cob. The first locomotive to return was Prince. Following on from Prince was Meriden Emrys. The next participant was Linda. Followed by Blanche. Next up were Challoner, Mountaineers Components and Britomart. Challoner was working in reverse, having been the only locomotive to have run forwards in the official cavalcade. Britomart was followed by David Lloyd George and Earl of Merioneth. Then came Palmerston, seen here exchanging papers for running rights to Boston Lodge. Emerging from the distance came Valinhilly. Followed by Lilla. The mighty form of NGG 16 class number 143 then came into view. Followed by Russell and Taliesin. And the Tasmanian Garret. Followed by NGG 16, number 87. Lid then came into view. followed by Princess and Hugh Napier. And Large England Welsh Pony. With NGG 16, number 130 in close pursuit. It was now possible to see why the event was nicknamed the Traffic Jam on the Cobb, as number 130 had to wait its turn. After a while, it was able to proceed. James Spooner once again brought up the 200 wheels. Finally, bringing up 234 wheels off the cob, Dahuichang C2 class number 4 and South African Railways NG15 number 134. Notice how the Chinese locomotive, with its inside frames, piston valves and foundation ring above the main frames, owes much in its inspiration to 1930s German practice. Number 134 owes its design origins to an Otavi Railway Henschel class, of which two 1911 examples survive in Namibia. Once again, congestion was prevalent, and these two locomotives had to wait their turn for Boston Lodge. By this stage, the weather, never exactly favourable, had taken a considerable turn for the worse.
After the cavalcade, many of the locomotives could be seen on display at Boston Lodge whilst winding down from the event. Here, Meredin Emery's can be seen in the carriage shed. Whilst on another carriage shed road, the two rebuilt ex-Penryn Hunslet ladies were also present. Linda, seen on the right, retained its original pattern cab side sheets and slide valves, whilst Blanche has acquired later pattern cab side sheets, a tender cab and piston valves. The Ffestiniog Railway Simplex petrol tractor, aka Mary Ann, was originally purchased by the Ffestiniog and Welsh Highland Railway companies from the Kent Construction Company in 1923. It was the first locomotive of any description to be put into working order during the preservation era, crossing the Cobb for the first time on September the 21st, 1954. On July the 23rd, 1955, it worked the first passenger services on the newly reopened section of the line. On June the 20th, 2025, during the early part of the Platinum Jubilee celebrations, the locomotive participated in reenactments of these historic moments. It is seen here taking a well-earned rest in the paint shop at Boston Lodge on June the 22nd, 2025. There were also some interesting wagons which were on display in the paint shop. One was a 1980s built replica of an early wooden horse dandy wagon. The originals were used for the carriage of horses during the pre-steam era, but they found other uses, principally as coal wagons, once steam locomotives had been introduced. This view shows the door for the horse, which normally faced Porthmadog on the uprun. A four-wheel wagon, designed for the conveyance of a small road vehicle, and possibly for use by the Oakley family or Charles Easton Spooner, was built at Boston Lodge in 1884. It is thought to have disappeared in the late 1930s. This replica was built between 2018 and 2024, and it was publicly launched at the Bygones weekend during that latter year. By contrast to the replicas, the hearse van, which incorporates inside wheel bearings and double end doors, is a conversion of a Mark II quarryman's carriage undertaken between July 1885 and June 1886. In use throughout its pre-preservation career, it was restored to working order in 1991, since when it has seen use on 3 rare occasions. This view, taken from the other end of the vehicle, shows the open doors and coffin rollers. Each corner of the roof is adorned with a funeral urn. A vertical boiler locomotive, Leary, was built by a group of Ffestiniog Railway volunteers in 2010. Fitted with a water tube boiler from a half-scale Sentinel lorry and a small marine 2-cylinder engine, it made its public debut at the Quirks and Curiosities event in 2010 and was sold to the Richmond Light Railway in Kent 7 years later. During this time, it had been decided to replace Leary with a new locomotive, Panad, which would more closely resemble the original De Winton design. The new mainframe blanks were completed by December 2016, with wheel castings following in November 2022. The rolling chassis was assembled by the end of that year. There have been various component donations, including a De Winton pattern injector, and a new boiler with 88 fire tubes arrived on site in May 2025. Completion of the locomotive is anticipated within 3 years. Unlike the original De Winton locomotives in preservation, Panad's drive to the leading axle will be via an intermediate shaft and gearing, following on from Leary as built. The spirit of renewal, as evidenced by recent products such as Taliesin and James Spooner, is very much still alive at Boston Lodge, and it is only to be hoped that it will be carried on in the years to come.